Will Jalen Hurts ever win a Super Bowl as the Philadelphia Eagles franchise quarterback? We're going to get into that and more on this Monday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome on in, Eagles fans, to this Monday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. Thanks so much for making us your first listen each and every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more as playoffs wind down. The sports stop sporting like we want them to, but this summer FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everybody every day all summer long. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started. We're still in the dead zone of the offseason, but Philadelphia Eagles training camp does start in 2 weeks. Cannot wait for some real Eagles football to kickstart the 2024 offseason. Until then, though, we're still, again, like I said, trudging along through the quiet time of the NFL. And really, when you look at the 12-month calendar, this is like the only quiet part of the NFL. Regular season, offseason, it normally does not stop except for this month of the year. You look at like halfway through June up until halfway through July. That's really the dead zone. And I've had some time to just think about some more general, broader topics with the Philadelphia Eagles and the NFL in general. I was reading some sort of article about quarterbacks, and I started to just look at the general quarterback landscape of the NFL right now. And the one thought I had was how young quarterback is right now across the entire league in both conferences, how mobile it is, and just you look at like the old guards kind of gone outside of, you could say Aaron Rodgers, Russell Wilson, Matt Stafford. Is that really it? You look at the league right now, there's only 4 quarterbacks that are starting that have rings. Russell Wilson, Matt Stafford, Aaron Rodgers, and Patrick Mahomes. Everybody else right now in the league, 28 quarterbacks are ringless. And that, I feel like, is rare, right? Because there's been times where, Aaron Rodgers had one already, Drew Brees, Eli Manning, Peyton Manning, Tom Brady, Ben Roethlisberger, Joe Flacco. There were a lot of quarterbacks, Russell Wilson. There were a lot of quarterbacks in football that had rings playing at the same time. Brett Favre. That really is not the case right now. And it's, again, because the NFL is so currently young. Like, this is the new era of quarterbacks, and Jalen Hurts is one of those guys. Funny enough, now, like, the old guard, you could say, is anybody like 5+ years in. Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Patrick Mahomes, Dak Prescott, Jalen Hurts. It's crazy. Jalen Hurts is heading into year 5. This is going to be year 5. Carson Wentz only played 5 years, which is crazy to me because that felt like a lifetime. Carson Wentz only played 5 seasons in a Philadelphia Eagles jersey. Jalen Hurts is already at the length of time that Carson Wentz was in Philly. Like, that's unbelievable. Time has completely flown. And I did think about, because I was thinking about rings and who's got one, who's going to get one. I think Josh Allen eventually gets one. I think Lamar Jackson and Joe Burrow eventually get one. And I asked the question to myself, and then to Twitter, I put up a poll. Does Jalen Hurts ever get a ring? And if so, is it with the Philadelphia Eagles? And of course, right now, it's kind of optimism season. Like, everybody's feeling good about their football team. The Eagles look great on paper and look primed to be a top contender in the NFL yet again for a championship. 80.7% of you that I asked the question, will the Eagles win a Super Bowl with Jalen Hurts as the franchise quarterback? 80.7% of you said yes. 19.3% of you said no. And I totally get that. He's only, 25 years old. You could get another decade, 15 years out of this guy if all things go well. And when you look at it, most elite top 5, top 10 quarterbacks, like, they get at least one ring, right? Brady got his. Peyton Manning got his. Eli Manning got his. Even the guys that just had one, like, they got at least one if they were elite for a long stretch of time. For 5, 7, 10 years, right? Both Mannings, Brady, Brees, Rodgers, Big Ben, Joe Flacco, now even Matt Stafford. Like, who that was consistently throughout the vast majority of their career that were top 5, top 10 quarterbacks in the last 24 years, the last 21st century, who didn't get one? I guess you could say like Phillip Rivers, Donovan McNabb, actually, with the Philadelphia Eagles, Cam Newton, Matt Ryan. Like, those are probably the 4 that I can think of off the top of my head. But those guys honestly were more like they had top 5, top 10 seasons, but they were more fringe top 10 than they were like elite, consistent top 5, top 7 guys, right? Donovan McNabb, I don't think was consistently a top 5 quarterback. Matt Ryan had his MVP season, but was he always seen as a top 5, top 10 guy? I would probably say top 10. Same with Cam Newton, but even Phillip Rivers, like I think these guys, yeah, you could say they were all top 10 the majority of their career, but not always top 5. The guys that were consistently top 5 throughout their career, they all got one. That's why I believe Josh Allen will eventually get one, and same with Lamar Jackson. I don't think there's been a quarterback that's won 2 MVPs that hasn't won a Super Bowl. Like Dan Marino is one of the rare instances of a legendary quarterback not getting a ring. And I guess the question, the posing question is, how good do you think Jalen Hurts is? Do you think he's closer to those top 5 guys that I'm mentioning? Or do you think he's more in that fringe top 10 tier? Like, is Jalen Hurts closer to Aaron Rodgers and Drew Brees and the Mannings, or is he closer to, and like Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, or is he closer to the Matt Ryans, the Phillip Rivers, the Donovan McNabbs? Because those guys aren't guaranteed to get Super Bowls. I personally think he's closer right now to those top 5 players than the top 10. So in that way, you'd say, yes, he does get a ring, especially also considering his age. The fact that he was an MVP runner-up just 2 years ago and got to a Super Bowl, outdueled, in my opinion, one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time in Patrick Mahomes, the greatest quarterback in the league right now. Last year, more than halfway through the year, he was an MVP candidate. He was an MVP favorite before the collapse. He's got a really good roster around him. He's in a conference that doesn't have a ton of great quarterbacks. So for all those reasons, you probably say, I'm feeling pretty good that he's going to get a ring in Philadelphia. But I will say, with that being said, there's only one ring a year. And are we guaranteeing that Jalen's going to get one, and Josh Allen, and Lamar Jackson, and Joe Burrow, and like a Trevor Lawrence and a CJ Stroud? There are so many good young quarterbacks right now and it's not like Patrick Mahomes isn't going to win another ring. Got news for you. He's not going to end his career with just 3 rings. Pat's going to get at least 1 or 2 more. So is there enough room for Jalen to get his? And there's going to be also teams, by the way, that don't have great quarterbacks that have loaded rosters that'll win one. I wouldn't be surprised eventually if San Francisco gets one with Brock Purdy or Detroit gets one with Jared Goff. Like, that's something that I could see. Or the Miami Dolphins with Tua Tagovailoa. I think there's a very good chance Jalen does get one. I think he's somebody that has what it takes to sustain success over a long period of time, to be what Donovan McNabb was for the Philadelphia Eagles, because the Eagles have just not been able to get quarterback right for more than 5 years since Donovan. Like, they have not had that kind of sustained play since number 5, and I think Jalen Hurts is the best chance to replicate that kind of career. So I think for a lot of those reasons I laid out, yeah, I think he could get a ring. And like I mentioned, the vast majority of elite quarterbacks end up getting at least one. But at the same time, most quarterbacks, how many shots do they really get at the big game? And he's already had his shot, and it was as good of a shot as anybody could take. And man, did he give it his all. And he played a perfect game. Like, Jalen Hurts deserved that ring. If he got the ball back, if James Bradbury doesn't get flagged, I think he has a ring already. So I just wonder right now, gun to my head, I would say no, because there's so many good quarterbacks. And it's so hard to get back to that Super Bowl. Some guys have done it before, but it's very hard. And the majority of guys don't always get 2 cracks. I mean, who has gotten 2 opportunities, multiple shots at it? Brady, Eli, Peyton, Mahomes, Big Ben. Like, there's a lot of guys that have, but most of them haven't, right? And especially guys that lost. Like, those are all players I mentioned that won a ring. Who are the quarterbacks that lost that got back? Donovan McNabb never got back. Cam Newton, Matt Ryan never got back. Phillip Rivers never even got there. Who lost a ring that eventually got back there and won one? In my lifetime, I don't know if there is anybody. And so that's something that you have to weigh in. And I'm also just scarred and assume there's no way this goes smoothly with Jalen Hurts for a decade plus as the franchise quarterback, because in my lifetime, I'm only 27. Even with McNabb as the franchise guy, I was a young kid. As a coherent Eagles fan, and now that's working in the industry as an Eagles analyst, I've never seen this team be able to sustain a long-term healthy relationship with a quarterback. They have commitment issues with this position. And so, gun to my head right now, I don't want to be the pessimist, but I'd say no, I don't think he gets a ring. I think the Eagles are consistently good for a very long time with Jalen, and they have as good a shot as anybody to win a Super Bowl, as much as Josh Allen of the Buffalo Bills, Lamar Jackson of the Baltimore Ravens, C.J. Stroud and the Houston Texans. But there's a lot of guys, there's a lot of teams. History tells us it's very, very hard, especially when you don't take advantage of that first trip to the big game. But I get the 80% of you that say he can get one, because I laid out a lot of reasons he can. I'm kind of on the fence with this, but I'd weigh it like 55-45 that he doesn't get one. That's what my gut is saying. I think that 2022 team is the best Eagles team in franchise history, and the fact that they didn't get one, like it's tough to say. I guarantee Jalen's going to get one, so I'm not sure. But it's fun to look at, and it's wide open in the NFL. Like, yeah, Patrick Mahomes is going to win more, but the league right now is very wide open. The parity is great, and I think the Eagles are going to be a unit this year. I wouldn't be surprised if they won it all this year. Like, that's the thing. Like, if Jalen Hurts did win a ring, I wouldn't be surprised. I don't think this is the post-2016 collapse of the Atlanta Falcons with Matt Ryan, where the Eagles are dead in the water, and he'll never have another shot. Like, I don't think that for sure, but maybe the best shot was behind him. I'm not so sure. Again, part of this is just me being scarred and just assuming the worst at this position with this football team. And that's because the Eagles, I think they might have a franchise quarterback problem. And there's a couple of reasons why. I'll get into that coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. Look, I love sports. I love them so much, and I never want them to stop. But as the playoffs do wind down, there's nothing going on right now. We get fewer games, and the sports aren't sportsing like we want them to. But FanDuel lets us keep the sports going whenever we want. All you got to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime you're in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everybody every day all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. Bet on the Philadelphia Phillies. It's a good bet. Most of the time this year, you're going to win your money. They are a unit. FanDuel is the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball and the Locked On Podcast Network. Thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Guys, are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Got to turn down the volume with all the shouting. Make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel, programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team. So I was discussing the idea, I was discussing the question in segment 1, will Jalen Hurts get a Super Bowl with the Philadelphia Eagles when it's all said and done? Will he get back to the big game, avenge that loss of Super Bowl 57, and hoist the Lombardi trophy like Nick Foles did? Will he ever get a ring? 80% of you said that you think he will. And again, I totally get why. I think he's a top 5, top 7 quarterback in football. He's only 25 years old. He's, to me, elite through the air right now, and as a runner, even with the collapse of last year, I think he is an elite player at this position. The Eagles have a really good roster around him. They have a great front office to help support him. He's in a conference where he's not dealing with the AFC gulag of Pat Mahomes, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, C.J. Stroud, Joe Burrow, Trevor Lawrence, Anthony Richardson. I like Will Levis. I think he's going to be good. There are so many good quarterbacks in that conference. Tua, even Aaron Rodgers. I mean, if Drake May pans out, it's ridiculous how many good quarterbacks are in that conference. Jalen doesn't have to deal with that. Like, there's a lot of reasons to think that he can get back there and this time win a ring. But again, some of the reasons I'm hesitant to say that he will, and I would lean towards no, one of them is because I I want to believe he's going to be the Eagles franchise quarterback for 10 plus years. I think he's got the right makeup for it. I don't think he's going to have a Carson Wentz-like regression and completely collapse this year or anytime soon. I think he can be your new Donovan McNabb and more. Like, he didn't choke in the playoffs 2 years ago. He had, to me, outside of Nick Foles, like maybe the best, and PFF says the same thing according to their Super Bowl grades. He had the second best Super Bowl performance of a quarterback ever, only behind Nick Foles. And that's per PFF. So I think he can be that guy. But, man, you just look at the Eagles, especially their recent history, and even with Donovan McNabb, like, things don't always go well. They don't end well with their franchise quarterbacks, and these relationships often aren't sustained for many reasons. And I think a lot of the times what happens is, the funny thing is, like, when the same thing happens, or kind of the same thing happens over and over again, right? And I've seen this in real life with like relationships, and I've heard people complain about this certain thing with this person, and then they're in a relationship with the next person, and they're complaining about the same thing with that person, and then the next one. And when the same problems occur over and over again with different people, eventually you got to wonder, maybe the problem is you, right? I mean, what's X? What's the consistent variable in these scenarios? It's you. And I'm not saying, like with the Eagles and their quarterbacks and their relationships with these quarterbacks, I'm not saying Donovan McNabb didn't have his issues and he wasn't insecure and he wasn't stubborn and he didn't choke in big moments and he wasn't willing to make things work with T.O. I'm not saying Donovan didn't have this bitter kind of vibe to him ever since he got booed being the second overall selection and because he wasn't Ricky Williams. I'm not saying Carson Wentz didn't have his issues where he was stubborn and oftentimes would not adjust his play style, especially after his injuries. I'm not saying that he didn't relate well to every player on the roster and like he wasn't the perfect leader at quarterback. I'm not saying Jalen Hurts himself isn't like he has room to grow as a leader. I'm not saying that he's someone that needs to be more vocal at times and doesn't have to always be stoic. I'm not saying he doesn't often say the wrong things in his press conferences. Like Jalen Hurts has his downfalls too. I'm not saying it's not embarrassing the way that he collapsed around just like everybody else did at the end of last year when he needed to be elevating this team more than ever after getting that giant contract. He fell on his face more than anybody. Like all of these quarterbacks have had their issues. Nick Foles, Michael Vick. Like the Eagles, there's justified reasons for why they moved on or why they have questions about certain players. But again, when things end messy each time and you're not able to sustain these long-term relationships, what's the one consistent variable? It's the city. And it's the organization. It's the guys up top that are consistent with all these players. It's the owner. It's the general manager. And you just look at like the way they've handled things, especially once these guys get these big contracts and they're established as the guy. It's really never smooth and it often ends messy. And we're kind of getting that with Jalen Hurts right now too. I'm not saying it's ending or the Eagles are questioning if Jalen Hurts is the guy, but you even look at like the press conference, right before OTAs ended, where he's talking about Nick Sirianni. And I didn't like the way Jalen handled that either. But guess what? A story shouldn't come out 2 days later that says anonymously that top executives inside the Eagles organization were not happy, were disappointed with the way Jalen handled that press conference. There shouldn't be anonymous sources last year pointing fingers at Jalen Hurts as a leader and saying that they need him to be more vocal. Like, there shouldn't always be this anonymous source bashing Carson Wentz or the media always constructing these, like, crazy takes about Donovan McNabb and Carson Wentz and Jalen Hurts and just holding these players oftentimes to these impossible standards, oftentimes, like, making things up for the sake of content. Like, I'm not just saying it's the organization that's pointing fingers at the quarterback a lot of the time, even though it's a very self-defensive top of the team. Like Howie Roseman's a survivor. Jeffrey Lurie even, I think, at times did not handle the Carson Wentz era the right way. And the coaching staff as well. There's a lot of guys in there that are very self-preservation. Like that's their mindset. Like that is their priority. But also you look at just the city in general is so cutthroat at times with this position. And the media is. It's very hard to play quarterback to play it well and to stay happy in Philadelphia long-term at quarterback. Like, let's just call a spade a spade. That's just reality. And that's why sometimes these relationships don't really end that well. And I'm not like getting rid of responsibility for these players. Most of them did not consistently play well enough throughout their career to deserve being the Eagles quarterback for 10 plus years. But the environment at times doesn't always bode well for a franchise guy. Like, is Philadelphia made to be able to handle this kind of player long term? Like the Buffalo Bills will be set up to have Josh Allen, or the Kansas City Chiefs with Patrick Mahomes, or the Green Bay Packers. Like, the Eagles are not the Packers where they can have 20 years of Brett Favre and then 20 years of Aaron Rodgers and now 20 years of Jordan Love. That's just not been the way that they go about things. Even you look at like the tone-deaf draft pick of Jalen Hurts. Like, yeah, it panned out, but they should have known the situation they had with Carson Wentz heading into that 2020 offseason. And sometimes they just don't handle things the right way at quarterback. And we're getting that this offseason again with Jalen Hurts. And I'm not saying Jalen suddenly wants out of Philly, but eventually these things build and build and build. It was the same thing with Carson Wentz. Like, the stories started to circulate after the Super Bowl win. It was 3-4 years of stories of all of this kind of pressure and frustration in the making. And then the Jalen Hurts pick was the final straw that broke the camel's back. And I'm just saying I don't want to see that same fate happen with Jalen Hurts. But this team, this organization, this media market just can't help themselves with the anonymous sources talking about him, with the clickbait stories and the radio topics that are just completely unfair. Like, I'm not saying you can't criticize the quarterback. I criticize Jalen Hurts a lot for what he did last year. I criticize him more than anybody in the 2021 season. But there's a way to go about it. I just think sometimes we push these players out, and that's why when in segment 1 I was asking myself and you guys the question, will Jalen ever get a ring in Philly? I oftentimes will lean no with any of these guys because I just don't know if they're going to have enough time here to win a ring without catching lightning in a bottle, like the Eagles kind of did 2 years ago. So, and I've always been very anti-Donovan McNabb, at least over the last decade. I think he comes off very jealous and resentful when he critiqued Carson Wentz at times and Nick Foles and heck, even Jalen Hurts. I think he hated in a way or resented seeing the way the Eagles fan base like rallied around Carson Wentz and oftentimes Nick Foles. And I think he was jealous of that because they never really did that for him. But now, like, I kind of understand why he became who he is now and was in Philadelphia, why he didn't want to deal with T.O. Like, he dealt with a lot early on in his career when he was pretty damn good consistently year in and year out. Like, yeah, he choked a lot in the playoffs, but he dealt with a lot. Like, he didn't have great receivers. Again, he was booed off the stage basically the minute he got drafted by this football team. He was always held to, honestly, it felt like this impossible standard. It felt like the Eagles, the fan base or just in general, the majority of people never gave McNabb a fair shot from the start. And I think he did more than exceed expectations. So I kind of understand, relate to him the more I'm seeing these stories kind of go on repeat with all these quarterbacks. And it's mainly just, 2-3 guys, but it's happened consistently since McNabb left. And I don't want to see that happen again with Jalen Hurts. And I just wonder if this team, if this organization, the city, is built to not screw up the most important relationship there is in sports. It's your relationship with your franchise quarterback. All right, guys, coming up next, my random Eagles thought of the day. We're going to do these every Monday. It has to do with Eagles reunions. We'll get into that coming up next right here on Locked On Eagles. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience, the formula for winning championships, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions do apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. We're wrapping up this Monday edition of the podcast, and we're going to start some weekly segments on the show this year. And every Monday, we've got a random Eagles thought to wrap up the show. And my random thought today, and I thought about this, I'm just sitting out on the patio earlier, looking at some Chauncey Gardner-Johnson tape from 2022, seeing how his role led to so much success for him in Philly the first time around, and if the role will be any different with Vic Fangio as the defensive coordinator. And so I think for CGJ, this is a great situation for him to get back to who he was 2 years ago. Even if he doesn't get back to that elite guy that's like leading the league in interceptions, he was also really good in New Orleans before 2022, and I think he can get back to that player if he stays healthy. I think he's a perfect fit for Vic Fangio's scheme. The big question, though, again, is if he can stay healthy. And I started to think about that and how things didn't really work out with him in Detroit last year, and how the Eagles in the past have tried these reunions. And have they really worked? It's one of my favorite things in sports. And you guys know this if you've listened to the podcast for the last 7 years. Like, I love reunions for the Eagles, just in general. Like, seeing LeBron James go back to Cleveland and win a championship was amazing. I used to be an Anaheim Ducks guy back in the day for our hockey fans from the early 2000s and the 90s. Seeing Teemu Selanne go back to the Ducks and win a cup, this time as number 8, not number 13, that was awesome. Have the Eagles had success with these reunions? Like, will Chauncey Gardner-Johnson work out? What does history tell us with this kind of experiment? I would say it's worked out the majority of the time. Like, it literally got you a ring, i.e. Nick Foles. Like, Nick Foles had his LeBron James, Teemu Selanne kind of moment coming back to Philadelphia after getting traded for Sam Bradford and won you a ring. So can a reunion work in Philadelphia? You bet your ass. It literally won you your first championship ever. Signing Nick Foles in free agency was the best move you've made in your franchise's history. So yes, it can absolutely work. Actually, and even to a smaller degree, you look at a few years ago, Vinny Curry came back after he cashed in with Tampa Bay in 2018 after the Super Bowl season. He did come back to Philly in 2019 and 2020, and he was a pretty good rotational edge again. He had 5 sacks in 2019. He had an elite pass rush grade from PFF. Same with 2020, only 3 sacks that year, but got to the quarterback very efficiently, very consistently as that fourth guy, because remember, they still had Brandon Graham as the 1. They had Derek Barnett they were still hoping was going to pan out, and same with Josh Sweat. So Vinny Curry came back as he was the starter before 2018, then came back as the 4th guy and gave you 8 sacks in 2 years. Like, Vinny Curry coming back quietly was a good reunion move as well. So you've had some success with this in the past. Nick Foles, Vinny Curry. Then, of course, there are some not-so-good ones. My favorite one that breaks my heart it didn't work out is Deshaun Jackson, of course, coming back in 2019 and 2020. That didn't work out because of injuries. Jeremiah Trotter, if you remember, came back in 2009 to play 12 games, was a shell of who he was before he left Philadelphia. So there's some times that the reunions don't work, Deshaun Jackson, Jeremiah Trotter, and there's some times that it does. Nick Foles, Vinny Curry. I think CGJ is going to lean closer towards the Foles Curry side than Trotter and Djax, because again, he's still extremely young. He's a perfect scheme fit. He did stay healthy in 2022. It's not like this guy's injury prone where he's missing a ton of games every single year. When he did play for the Lions last year, he was a good player. Like, there's no signs of Chauncey slowing down. So I do think this is going to work out. I don't think, this deal is a 3-year deal that can be a 1-year if it doesn't work out. Like, they can get out of this if it doesn't work this year, and they can go full-fledged into the Reed Blankenship, Sidney Brown, Cooper DeJean era at safety. But I think this is going to work with Chauncey. I don't think this is going to be like Deshaun Jackson or Jeremiah Trotter. I think this is going to be a good reunion. I think it's going to work. And you know what? I still believe this is not going to be the only reunion in 2024. I know he's on a division rival right now, but if the Washington Commanders are out of the playoff race before the deadline, I still think there's a way Zach Ertz ends up being a Philadelphia Eagle again. Like, would the Commanders not give their rival Zach Ertz if they are willing to give them like a 4th or 5th rounder. I don't think if Washington's out of it, they're going to say, no, we're not giving Philly Zach Ertz to be their second tight end. I could totally see Ertz coming back, especially if none of these young kids take a step up behind Dallas Goedert. If Goddard gets hurt again, I still think there's a chance Zach Ertz ends back in Philly. He ends up back here at some point this year. Also, too, because Washington drafted Ben Sinnott, who was, to me, a top 3 tight end prospect in this past draft class. And they like him a lot. They drafted him on day 2. So I think at some point Zach Ertz could become available again. I could see him being an Eagle once again this year. So CGJ might not even be the only reunion that happens this year. I love reunion talk. I think with Chauncey, it is going to work. I think he's one of the more underrated players on the team this year. I think getting him back this offseason, I said this on the show, I think last week, or on another podcast maybe, I'll say removing the draft, Quinyon Mitchell was the best move you made this offseason. Even over bringing in Saquon Barkley, bringing back CGJ was the move of the offseason. I think it's going to be the most impactful for this football team. All right, guys, that's going to do it for today's edition of Locked On Eagles. Thanks so much for tuning in and making us your first listen each and every day. 4 more shows for you this week, so make sure to subscribe on all podcast platforms and on YouTube as well. As always, thanks so much for downloading, watching, and listening, and let's go Birds. Fly, Eagles, fly.